Welcome to Know My Faith. My guest is Cherie Trotter from the Indigenous Coalition.org. Does it have the?
Well, the name is Indigenous Coalition for Israel, but the website is indigenouscoalition.org.
All right, so tell me about the Indigenous Coalition for Israel. What started it?
Well, we got it started last year with fellow director, Honourable Alfred Ngaro, and we wanted to provide a platform for Indigenous voices to stand in support of Israel. And so one of our members of our advisory council was the Kaumatua Pat Ruka, who sadly passed away at the end of last year. But he was a real visionary and driving force, a big part of what we were doing. And he has done some pretty momentous things, really, in the last few years. So, for example, after New Zealand co-sponsored UN Resolution 2334, our ambassador was sent away and then came back again some months later. Well, Matua Pat organised a special hui for the ambassador to welcome him back, but also by way of apologising for what New Zealand had done.
So this is the Israeli ambassador when he came back?
Yes, when the Israeli, that was Ambassador Gerberg, when he came back, there was a porphyry, a welcome for him at Hwane Waititi Marae in Auckland. And this was really the initiative of Matua Pat Ruka. And it was a very powerful event. And, you know, iwi coming together, iwi members coming from all around the motu and Pākehā and Jewish people as well. And he organised a number of hui. And then early last year, he organised another welcome for the new ambassador. And Ran Jacobi, and that was...
I like him. Do you like him?
Yeah,
I like him.
Yeah, he's a good guy. And that was held up at Waitangi.
Okay.
And
so these hui were to say, we're sorry that...
Well, the initial one was,
resolution
it was called a whakapaha, so it was a ceremony of apology, and it was something that Matua Pat felt very strongly needed to be done to put right something that had been wrong. You know, Israel had been wronged, and we needed to put it right, and so there was a lot of deep meaning behind that. But this most recent one at the beginning of last year was a welcome to the new ambassador, and it was also held on Earth Day, so there was a symbolic exchange of trees, of the olive tree and the kauri tree, and it was a very beautiful occasion. And if people have a chance to, there was a short video created that really captures the power of that event.
It is powerful. When we were in Israel, which is nearly 5 years ago now, and I almost cry every time I say that because we want to get back, but the Messianic Fellowship that we were associated with moved into a new building, and so they're Jewish Messianic Fellowship, but they have a very, very close relationship with an Arab Christian church, and so the Arab pastor and the Messianic congregation leader both planted an olive tree together outside the. It's very, very powerful thing to do. You could, if somebody's watching this or listening to this, you could almost be forgiven for thinking this is a Māori coalition, Indigenous Māori coalition for Israel, but it's not.
No, it's an Indigenous coalition, so Māori, Pacifica and other Indigenous peoples. I mean, locally, of course, Māori are the Indigenous here, but because, you know, the Māori voice is, all these voices are small on their own, so we're bringing together under an Indigenous umbrella just to build that platform for us as Indigenous peoples. And of course, a lot of Pacific people in New Zealand love Israel, support Israel, and it's a way for us in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to have a platform for these voices.
All right, so we're including the Aboriginal people in Australia, the First Nations people?
It's part of our kaupapa, as it were, to connect, collaborate with similar groups, and we've started to do that. So we have a connection with the Australian group, the Indigenous Friends of Israel there, with an American group, and with Canada as well. And, you know, that's part of what we're aiming to do.
So they've started, these are different groups?
Yeah, they're all independent groups to us, and we're just developing associations with other groups that are already there.
So it must be a new thing, because I haven't heard of this like 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Australia's been around since 2017,
Okay.
and the Indigenous Bridges has been around a few years now, maybe around the same time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, maybe 5 to 10 years.
5 to 10 years, yeah.
Yeah, I would say.
And you all have a combined purpose?
Well, each group has its own individual kind of purpose. For example, Indigenous Bridges in America, they have a kaupapa to really help the Native Americans in their struggles and get alongside them, and so that's a real focus for what they're doing. So each group has a slightly different kaupapa, but there's a lot of similarities, and just joining hands across the globe, we can do something globally as well as locally, and that's what part of our intention is, and that has been unfolding actually. I managed to have a couple of articles published on international platforms like Tablet Magazine, which is an American Jewish magazine. And as a result of that, I was invited by the Canadian Anti-Semitism Group and the Canadian Jewish Research Group to do a webinar. So I did that with them in January. And then I also had an article published on the Jerusalem Post, and as a consequence, I've got 2 other international webinars coming up.
Okay.
And one is Creative Communities, which is really based around Hollywood and trying to push against BDS, the Boycott, Sanction, Divestment movement. And the other one's held in Tel Aviv. Unfortunately, I couldn't go to Tel Aviv this month. Would like to have, but I will be Zooming in and joining.
Just for, most of us who understand BDS understand it, but there might be people watching or listening that don't. Can you just unpack that a little?
So the boycott, sanction, divestment movement is this idea that you need to sanction Israel, you need to boycott their products in order to punish Israel, basically, or pressure them to. It's a pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel kind of a movement, but it's very discriminatory and it's very counterproductive. It usually ends up in actually hurting the Palestinians. So one of the best examples is SodaStream, which came under a lot of boycott, and they had a factory in the West Bank, and as a result of the boycott against them, they had to move out of the West Bank. So in the West Bank, they were able to employ lots of Arabs, but once they moved out, and they're now in south of Israel
because they're an Israeli company.
So those Palestinians are actually missing out on an income that they had previously. So it's very harmful, and its real goal is about demonising Israel and the dismantling of the State of Israel. So it doesn't work towards peace at all. It just works towards dismantling the State of Israel.
It kind of backfires on the people they're trying to help. How does the Indigenous Coalition for Israel, you're looking at the Jewish people as the indigenous people of the land. So how does that relate to Arab people whose families have been there for, in some cases, centuries?
So a key thing is understanding what indigeneity actually means. And that's notwithstanding the fact that there's no set definition of indigeneity. But in 2007, the UN set up this Indigenous kind of definition. It helped to define indigeneity, and there are a number of facets that are involved. But I think the main thing to keep in mind is that an Indigenous people developed their unique culture within a particular land.
We would say the Maori people, although we know the Maori came from Pacifica, the Maori culture was developed in Aotearoa, therefore Maori are the indigenous people.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So and we've got to be very careful here to make sure we are not denigrating Palestinians or Arabs at all, but the Arab-Palestinian culture did not develop in the land?
The Palestinians came to that area around 700 AD, and their culture developed in Arabia, in the wider Middle East, not in that specific land of Judea, Samaria. So that is why they are not indigenous to that land. So there is a claim that they descended from the Canaanites who were there before the Jews, but there's actually no evidence for that. And so this is, ahistorical, and it's just a political weapon, really, to try and disallow the Jews their indigeneity.
So this is also coming in with imposing a different culture on them. And again, you've got to be careful we don't get into trouble here, but the British that came to Aotearoa, to New Zealand, who imposed the British culture on the land. So the Jews that are in the land, are they imposing a culture on? Because when you talk to Jews, Israelis, you find that their heritage is French, is Romanian, is Ethiopian, is all over the place. So what culture, if we're talking about Indigenous culture, what culture is it that we're talking about with the Jews in Israel?
We're talking about the original Indigenous culture, which is really connected to their scriptures, of course, and you'll see that a lot of the scriptures are very land-based. A lot of their religion and practices are very land-based. And so, we've got to look at the deeper history of the Jewish people, the fact that they were expelled, they were dispossessed, and and that is all actually part of being Indigenous people, because that's happened to Indigenous people in other parts of the world as well. They've been expelled from their land, dispossessed from their land. So, as Indigenous people, we can look at the Jewish people as being the forerunners, because they've managed to establish themselves in their ancient homeland. And so that's inspiring for us as Indigenous people. We might not get what we had, but, we can re-establish some sort of mana.
I remember when Mike Smith chopped down the tree, or sawed down the tree on One Tree Hill in Auckland, and there was one comment, a letter to the editor in the Herald, and it said if he was so interested in the Maori land rights and everything, why did he use a white man's chainsaw? To which I responded, I said, well, that's pretty arrogant of you to assume a white man invented the chainsaw. but the other question, the other answer is then it was the 20th century now. We're not going back to the 18th or 19th century. Maori use chainsaws. Maori drive cars. So the culture, so when we're talking Indigenous culture, it doesn't have to be as it was in the days of Jesus.
No. And for Māori culture, just, jumping in on that idea, Māori were always open to innovation, to new things. We were very keen to trade for those axes, which was the new technologies. So, Māori culture is not set in stone. And
nobody's culture. Well, actually, no, the only one that is a dead culture.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And it shifts and changes, but there are aspects of it that you hold on to, and they're to do with, ancestry, whakapapa for Māori, same for Jewish, whakapapa. These are important aspects of indigeneity. And, the practices that are connected to the land is very clear in Jewish culture and also in Māori culture.
You talked about yourself and Alfred Naro heading up the coalition. You're both believers. Is the coalition a Christian coalition?
We call it a Christian initiative.
Okay.
And that's just being clear about where we're coming from with what we're trying to do. But we are really wanting to speak into the political space. We're not a ministry as such, and there are a lot of Christian ministries out there, but because we have this distinctive, I suppose, of being Indigenous people and really wanting to highlight the Indigenous connection with the Jewish people and the Indigenous argument, which is quite current at the moment. And, the reason it's so very important is because it's being used effectively as a political weapon against the Jewish people, particularly at the UN. So the UN is, like the end of last year, there was a Jerusalem resolution which didn't even give the Jewish name for the Har HaBayit, the HaKotel. It wasn't even referred to in the resolution. And when you read that resolution, it goes even further to try and completely disconnect any Jewish connection to Israel.
It's interesting, when I moved to Katikati to pastor the Christian Centre, one of the first things I did was it was a meeting on Treaty 4 New Zealanders for immigrants. And what the lady did that was running it, she put a large map of our country on the floor. And it had all the Māori place names on it, Te Waipounamu, Aotearoa. And then she handed out these cards that had the English names on it. And she goes, put these in the right place. So everybody goes around and puts Auckland over, Tamaki Makaurau. And she goes, what have you done? And I said, I just stole their country. All I did was I took away their language and I imposed my... And so you're saying this is similar to what the UN is doing
Yes,
in
and
Israel.
that's a type of colonisation, cultural colonisation. And that's what the UN is doing, is colonising the Jewish connection to Jerusalem, of all places.
Yeah.
So this is why I think the Indigenous argument is important to understand, because there's been this false idea that's been propagated for a number of years that Palestinians are the Indigenous people and the Israelis or the Jews came in as colonisers and took over the land. And that's incorrect. That's factually, historically incorrect.
Are you wanting people to join the coalition? Are you wanting them to just support the coalition? What do we do?
Absolutely.
So what is the process?
Well, go on.
But hang on, I'm not Indigenous, so...
Oh, no, well, we want support from anybody who agrees with our kaupapa and wants to help us with it and follow us. So we have a website. You can go on and sign up for newsletter. We've got Facebook. So we send out semi-regular newsletters. And, support us financially. We welcome that.
Cherie, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.